Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Leslie James, Queen Mary, University of London.
fantastic. Now, you're near Brick Lane.
Yes, just
So
around the
you go
corner.
out there for lunch? Is that where you get your lunch?
It's not that close.
Not
No,
that close.
no. But I've lived a long time around Brick Lane in various ways.
But you can go and see the Thames. Or you can
Yes, and I live and actually the university is on the canal
Yeah,
that will
fantastic.
take you to Brick Lane.
So my first grown-up question, Prof, is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you. What's going on?
I guess there's two. So the real life impeding is something maybe many people who work in universities are dealing with right now. It is that my institution is going through a merger. And my history is now a department along with politics and geography. And so we're trying to figure out how to work together and how to live in a consolidated world where the institution presumes that AI are going to do half of the work, even though it's not really happening. So that's what's impeding me is living through an institutional merger where I have a leadership role. What's dynamizing me or what's interesting me intellectually is also the world of geopolitics. What might come out in our discussion is that for a long time I've lived in the 1930s. My brain has lived in the 1930s. And so our current global climate is something that I've been seeing for the last 10 or more years. And so thinking about the ways that people in the 1930s inhabited a number of different political ideas and affiliations and how those could be made sense of, not just in a kind of binary left and right. I don't think we get to the world that we now live in a world where it appears very binary as left and right, but I don't think that's how we get here. I think it's much more murky, and I think that's what happened in the 1930s, and so then it's also thinking about how that's happening now.
That's interesting if you think about the fact that Habermas was in the Hitler Youth.
Yeah.
Günter Grass thought that Mitterrand was on the far right, seconds before he was a socialist.
Yeah.
In the resistance. And on it goes. Paul de Man wrote, anti-Semitic journalism during the occupation of Belgium, and then became a celebrated North American deconstructionist. Things were a bit more complicated for sure. But I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that, because one of your bits of writing, wonderful bits of writing that I was able to get hold of, and because I live in the global South, your books are not available to me. But one of the bits that I read and really learned a lot from was the one about lessons on fascism to be learned from Africa's colonial past.
Oh.
Yeah.
We lost each other.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I got as far as one of the bits of writing that I read and then lost you.
Can we learn about fascism from Africa's past? And this is a piece about the 30s. So I wondered if you could perhaps talk about that essay, but also elaborate your point about the left-right continuum not necessarily being the most relevant for the current conjuncture or for back then.
Yeah. So I'll start there, because a lot the characters in this book and in the chapter, I increasingly found just don't make sense in that left-right spectrum. It's just not how we can possibly make sense of their politics. You have people like someone like Wilfred Domingo, who was a Jamaican socialist-leaning, communist aligned at various points, but also and wrote in the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro Journal, but also then goes back to Jamaica in the 1940s and writes at the same time and edits two different newspapers, one which is socialist aligned with the People's National Party, another which is Garveyite aligned. And so how do you make sense of someone's politics that seemed to embody antagonistic political movements? And Domingo was one of the people who wrote very forthrightly against fascism in the 1930s via an analysis of colonial rule. So the piece that you're referring to came out of my reading of reading newspapers and seeing how much they are debating the nature of fascism by comparing it to their experiences under colonial rule. And what they produce in the 1930s becomes, people might be familiar with Aimé Césaire's arguments in Discourse on Colonialism, that Hitler had nothing to learn from, that basically the British were, and French, were doing the same things in their colonies, that fascism was simply colonialist procedures applied to Europe. That's the Césaire quotation. But he writes that in the 1950s. But what you see in the publications of the 1930s and in the debates that are underway in newspapers is people making these same arguments, is people looking at how the colonial authorities are responding to strikes and protests by deploying militias, civilian militias, by violently suppressing a racialized labor force in ways that they would never do in the metropole, by banning books and freedom of speech, by potentially discussing sterilization schemes, racial segregation. So they pull all of many of the practices that they're seeing arise in Nazi Germany, and kind of the use of forced labor by Italy in Ethiopia, for example, and then the use of forced labor by British and French colonial forces on the African continent, and putting these all together into an argument about how colonial behaviors are very, very similar to fascist behaviors. Jawaharlal Nehru said that colonialism and fascism were blood brothers walking hand in hand. And so there is really very apparent, and the other thing to say, to come back to my earlier point about like the nature of politics, is that the people that are making those arguments are not just Marxists. They are, you have kind of conservative, highly educated African elites in Nigeria and the Gold Coast who are otherwise quite conservative in their politics, making these really astute comparisons between settler colonial rule, white supremacy in settler colonies, and fascism and colonialism. So these arguments span the political spectrums in the colonies as well.
And of course, in the era of struggle for independence, let's say, particularly from the post-war period through to the 60s, very often these intellectuals across political spectra and political leaders and poets and so on make temporary alliances with the Soviet Union
Yeah.
or with the People's Republic of China, or they don't. And frequently, communism is no friend to anti-colonialism, particularly under Stalin and the doctrine of socialism in one country. And so these alliances have to be carefully done. One thinks of the non-aligned movement in the 50s and so on. So I take your point. How does that connect? Pardon me, Prof. I finished the breakfast, by the way. I'm now onto the tea. So I'm slightly more civilized, I hope. How does that relate to today, which is where we began?
I guess, well, so one thing to say is because I've actually been having these conversations with a number of different people, and one thing to say is that these kinds of comparisons are operating as analytic tools, right? So the comparisons, no comparison is going to be exact. That's not the point of doing comparisons. And so they can be quite controversial, right? Because you put these things together and you say, how could you possibly compare these things, right? They are different. And yes, they absolutely were. And one of the things that the people at the time ended up concluding was that at the very least, under, for example, British colonial rule, they had the possibility of freedom. They had the ever moving forward into the future idea of independence, which did not exist under fascism. So I took a step back there just to say that the politics of comparison was and is an important analytic tool to better understand the conjuncture that they are in. And so then that brings us to the present, that the comparisons that are being made right now to the 1930s, to me are striking, are very, very apt. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but in so many parts of, I mean, Japan right now, India, Brazil, and many other places beyond just now the United States, the rise of a far right extreme nationalism that is militaristic, that is masculine, that is patriarchal in many respects. These are very apt comparisons that are not exact. And the other thing that strikes me that I've been trying to think through what is relevant about what I saw in the 1930s, again, comes back to the fact that it feels like very polarizing political climate. This right now feels like a very polarized political climate. And it felt like that back then too. And it's easy to fall into that feeling because it almost is demanded. You have to take a side. You have to stake where you stand. At the same time, it's always much more messy than that. And there's always not necessarily, and you see it I saw it in colonial West Africa and the Caribbean, that there is not this binary that people are talking to each other, are working through ideas very carefully, in ways that never often put them in one place or the other, categorically. And to me, anyway, I find some solace in that it's not it's not complete polarized antagonism.
I think you put that very well, and I really like this notion that what you're looking for is heuristic appropriateness, devices that can allow for comparison without necessarily assuming an absolute equivalence. Of course, the really big difference is that there is much less formal colonialism in the classic sense of Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, Belgium, etc. And there's no worldwide state socialism movement.
Right.
So the idea of these big daddies, to go back to the patriarchal terminology that you were touching upon, manipulating things doesn't really apply. And there are more of these, what people now romantically call South-South dialogues. Often these are raised up in a very problematic way. So people speak about Asian theory as if a person living a rural, analphabetic life in Bangladesh has something in common with a Hong Kong futures trader.
Yeah.
Right? This is just arrant nonsense. But there are really interesting points of connection that emerge, I think, for folks. And in terms of the polarization, I guess I'm not one of these people who thinks polarization is a dirty word. I mean, I've lived most of my professional life in the United States, gracias muy amable, though I don't sound like it. But there, the idea of there being a sort of moral purity on the part of the middle.
Yeah.
For example, Congress people who reach out across the aisle. I just think, dude, what are you doing? You want to negotiate with fascists? Well, I don't.
Yeah.
Just say you're wrong.
Yeah.
So part of me wonders about that a little bit. On the other hand, I also have a certain nostalgia in a Canadian context, for example, for the idea of Yaru Betcher and we get along.
Yeah.
And for the British post-war consensus about decolonizing, albeit for selfish reasons, in terms of the economy, but also the sort of Butskellite Accords that were broken apart by Thatcher. So I'm ambivalent about being anti-polarization because I don't like the idea of selling out one's principles. On the other hand, I am a bit nostalgic, pathetically, for certain kinds of consensus. Can you help me out, Prof?
Well, so I fully agree that like I think maybe I was explaining it, or maybe this dialogue is helping because the polarization, I mean, should be like based on principles, right? So we have certain principles that guide us, and you take a stand and you say, this is where I stand on this. The polarization occurs, but it shouldn't be, it's dynamic, I guess, is maybe a better way of putting it, that we shouldn't presume that people are going to take a particular stand in one way or another. We should always be kind of listening to the ways that people's politics collide in different ways. And in seemingly surprising ways. I think that's what you asked me what was most interesting to me. It's always when people takes kind of surprise, they surprise you. They take a stand that you might not have thought, and then you're forced to look again and say, okay, why would you take that position? Ah, okay, I see why you would take that, why this aspect of your values and beliefs would make you take a position in that way that might seem surprising, but that actually are perfectly logical. I'm currently looking at delving into an organization that had surprising influence, but that very few people have written about. It's called Moral Rearmament. I don't know if have you heard of Moral Rearmament?
For sure, big time.
Okay.
It was very influential in Britain after the war. And my father was Australian, and it was very influential in Australia after the war. It actually derailed the career of someone who could have been a great social democrat political leader, but was deemed to be crazy because he was in moral rearmament.
Yeah. So actually, it was founded around the corner from where I live at East Ham Town Hall. I actually just swore my allegiance to the king and became a British citizen at East Ham Town Hall, which is where moral rearmament was founded.
If it's any consolation, when I signed on to be a gringo, I did it in front of a judge in LA, and she was a friend of an ex-girlfriend of mine, also a judge.
Mhm.
So, because of all sorts of complicated travel things, I couldn't go to one of the two kinds of ceremonies they have, which in LA are either 300 or 10,000 people. So I had my own ceremony, and part of what you had to do was swear to bear arms on behalf of the United States. So I put my hands behind me and did this and crossed my fingers. And the judge said, Professor Miller, why do I get the sense that you're not really sincere about this? Anyway, sorry. There you are in East Ham Town
In
Hall.
East Ham Town Hall, which was the
Morally
founding
rearmed,
of moral rearmament
morally
workers'
rearmed
town
on
hall.
behalf of Charles III.
Yes. But the thing with so moral rearmament was also influential in in the African continent, at least in various ways. And so I'm trying to untangle and in the Caribbean. So for example, how do you get like a Rastafari community going to Mackinac in 1959? I mean, and these are fleeting. But how do you make sense of that fleeting moment? And how do you make sense of the fact that Azikiwe, the Nigerian first prime minister, major part of my book, certainly kind of African socialist leader, goes to a moral rearmament conference, and you have Kenyan leaders and Nigerian and Ghanaian leaders at various points in the early 1950s going to moral rearmament conferences, being intrigued by what seems like it might be a non-aligned path. Seems like it might be, for example, a way of people reconciling communities that are in conflict. So those aspects of moral rearmament appeal to people at various points. So so again, so maybe this is a good illustration of what I'm speaking about is that these are surprising. They don't make sense on the surface of it because we know that moral rearmament was like a heavily anti-communist Christian ideological movement that had tons of money going into it to buy a castle in Switzerland and another place and have another castle or another hotel in Japan, and that's cultivating all of these global leaders. It doesn't make sense to the politics or the trajectory of some of the people that I'm looking at. So then you have to look again and say, well, what would they have seen in it? What would they have found in it? And if it was fleeting, does it really mean anything that they engaged with moral rearmament or not? Do we take that seriously, or do we just say, oh, well, that was a small pragmatic moment that doesn't mean anything? I think it is an opportunity to figure out what the politics of people was at that time and what they were trying to negotiate that would make them then engage in it, even if fleetingly.
That sounds like a great project. Really, really interesting. My memory also is that there were a few cricketers who were in moral rearmament, probably in inverted commas, West Indian,
Yeah.
and some English white guys as well, back in the maybe early 50s, early to mid 50s.
Yeah.
It's a
Well,
split.
and what put me onto the oddness of it was that so the founder is Frank Bookman. The man who takes over is his name will come to me in a second, but he was a rugby player, I think, and or it's either rugby or football. I'm sorry. And then his first job when in the early 1930s was as what were called the Biff Boys, which was like the muscle for Oswald Mosley's early black shirt movement. So this is the guy that takes over moral rearmament. Now he has a he moves toward he leaves that. early British fascist movement, becomes more conservative, then has a conversion to moral rearmament. So he's evolving, right? But these are the forces that are all meeting in
Yeah.
the 1950s.
And of course, Mosley himself had been a Labour Party politician
Yeah.
before British Union of Fascists. I've been a socialist since I was about 6 months old, but I did briefly work for Chase Manhattan.
Mm.
No, but these things are interesting, I think, when you consider the twists and turns people can make. And I take your point about that. Where does Christianity fit into all of this? There are elements of Christianity in some incarnations of it that obviously connect to anti-colonial projects, for example. And there are others that are rah, rah, rah colonialists. Take a lot of right-wing evangelical Christianity today in the United States.
So the aspects of moral rearmament, again, because it's a heavily, they see Christianity as the ideology that they are going to preach, um, as a kind of third force in the Cold War, that is anti-materialist. So again, if we think about like a brief fleeting Rastafari interest, this is a movement that they can see as like anti-materialist, kind of human-oriented um, way of acceptance of all peoples and all paths and faiths. Um, and Several of the African participants are also they're Christians in various ways. So the Christian aspect I mean, people can come at it from various political positions into it. Yeah.
Point taken. Now, Prof, you've mentioned a couple of times elements of print culture
Yeah.
as some of your sources for delving back into the 30s. And I wondered if you could take me on a little tour, forgive my ignorance of your book writings,
Mhm.
of your of two pretty recent books, one that you wrote, one that you co-edited. I'm thinking here of The Moving Word, How the West African and Caribbean Press Shaped Black Political Thought, which came out last year, I think, and the co-edited book about Wilfred Domingo's writings. Could you give us a wee adumbration of that for listeners? For me, as your first listener?
Yeah. So the selected writings of Wilfred Domingo is largely, I have to give most of the credit to my co-editor, Peter Hume, who did almost all of the biographical work. Um, I brought the Jamaican aspects of Wilfred Domingo's publishing career into the picture. That volume really is it's his selected writings. So it is for the first time making his writing accessible because he is like many Black intellectuals, and this will lead into my other book, The Moving Word. They are not publishing books. They are prolific, extremely prolific, but they're not prolific. We don't see their contribution unless we look at the more ephemeral magazines and in particular newspapers. And so Domingo is one of those people. People might know him as somebody who published in Ellen Locke's New Negro volume in the Harlem Renaissance. People might know him for his battle against Garvey. They were childhood friends, but became enemies later in life. But he is little known because most of his writing, and he wasn't a full-time intellectual. He owned a business for most of the time. So that is pulling together work, all of his work that otherwise people wouldn't have access to. And then that leads me into, and he is a part of the book, The Moving Word. So he's one of many characters that I bring into a book that I can summarize it by saying the book tries to answer two questions. One is um, how, where does Black political thought happen? And how and who gets historicized as a Black intellectual? Those are the two questions that I wanted to intervene in. Where does Black political thought happen? It is intervening into a lot of work that gives the impression that Black political thought is either happening in the US, in kind of North America, particularly the US, or by colonized thinkers who are in London and in Paris and in these kind of metropolis hubs. Um, and then from there, all of the thought is dispersed outward. So it makes it seem like all of the thought happens in these places and then it goes out. And what the book tries to do by using newspapers that are publishing in Trinidad, Jamaica, Ghana, and Nigeria, show that actually there's a whole range of thinking that's happening across directly between West Africa and the Caribbean. It might go through New York, it might go through London or Paris, but these are not the central nodes for a lot of the thought that's happening. So that's the first kind of part, is to demonstrate the really rich set of debates that are happening in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s about the nature of freedom, about what we would now call racial capitalism, about fascism, about time and history, and those are the kind of chapters in the book. And then the second is who gets historicized as a Black intellectual. So it looks at newspaper editors, some who are named, but also overall tries to argue that a major part of Black political thought, it comes from what might be thought of as non-authorial texts, in the sense that sometimes we don't know who was writing them. They're pseudonyms or they're unsigned. There are letters from like primary literacy level people into Jamaican newspapers that are nevertheless contributing to these debates. And so it looks at how, when we put this all together, they are really pushing forward a lot of the political ideas that we tend to attribute to canonical people like W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm going to name some people that people might be familiar. CLR James, George Padmore, Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, Aimé Césaire, Nnamdi Azikiwe, people might know. So there's a much wider terrain of named people. I do try to show named, mostly men, a few women, who are also really pushing the conception of colonial rule in particular, but also capitalism, the nature of extraction and exploitation, and pushing how those are understood and analyzed in ways that sometimes we can attribute and sometimes we can't. Sometimes are coming from well-educated editors and proprietors, sometimes coming from people who are primarily orators, not writers. So there's a relationship in the texts and in print, not just from what's printed on the page, but what people are saying in town squares, in halls, in songs, and in verse. And there's a strong oral to print relationship in these newspapers that also comes forward again, that captures at one point there's a Trinidadian newspaper that's edited by a well-known labor leader who is really an orator. And when he's editing the paper, grammar and syntax tends to shift and change in really interesting ways. But he's an orator. That's who he is. And so once you put it together, you see a really very lively uh, forum for debate.
You mentioned there a couple of names that you've also written about in books, namely Padmore and James. Listo, gracias, sí, perfecto. And I'm wondering if you might tell us a wee bit about those books. The ones I'm thinking of, CLR, James, Nkrumah, and the Ghana Revolution, again, an edited volume, and George Padmore and Decolonization from Below, which is one I think you wrote on your own, if I've got it right. So of those people, probably CLR James is best known. He very wisely wrote about cricket, which means that all people who do sports sociology or history, even gringos, have to read him. But B, because he's become a latter-day hero of Black studies, often without much engagement with his Trotskyism and the different complex formations he was part of. Whereas Padmore, I think of as less well known in the Anglo Academy. Would that be fair, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is fair. And I came to Padmore through James. So I came to Padmore, but when someone handed me, sorry, I came to Padmore via James when someone handed me the Black Jacobins, and I read that. And then I came across Padmore, and then came across the fact that they were, they were friends from the time that they were children together. Um, the book on Padmore was actually, I'm going to do this slightly out of order. So CLR James, so he wrote Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution right after coming back from visiting Ghana at independence in 1957. Both George Padmore and CLR James were with Nkrumah in Ghana for the independence celebrations. Padmore worked for Nkrumah at the end of his life. James attended the ceremonies and was in Ghana and came back and wrote Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. And then it never really got finished. And it was unpublished for, I think, close to 2 decades. And then it was published by Margaret Busby, who was a Ghanaian Black British publisher who said to CLR James, what do you have that I can publish? And he said, oh, I have this, and it's never been published. So that was published by her first, and then it was re-released by Duke University Press. And I edited with Robert Hill the re-release of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. And that book, I mean, it's probably not as well known because it really wasn't fully finished. I don't think he fully had the time to really fully finish it, but he stood by it, and he published it. And in it, I mean, I think anybody would be, what he tries to do is say that revolutionary theory, of which he was well versed, he'd already written on the Haitian Revolution by that point and the Russian Revolution in various ways. And he argues in Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution that revolutionary theory has not only moved into new geographical terrain, into the African continent, it would be a disservice simply to say that, oh, well, now revolution is happening in Africa. He turns that on its head and says that revolutionary theory has also reached its new stage with what's happening in Ghana through Nkrumah's use of the general strike as a revolutionary tool. So that's how he positions Nkrumah in the Ghana Revolution as taking revolutionary theory into its next stages and phases. So that's that book. And then there's the book on Padmore, which I wrote first, and which led me into the book on newspapers. George Padmore and CLR James were both born in Trinidad together. They were childhood friends. They were both children of schoolmasters. So that was how they kind of came to know each other and were lifelong friends, even though they didn't occupy the same place. They were often in different continents from each other. But they were lifelong friends. Padmore, I'll just briefly give his bio, if that's okay. So he grows up in Trinidad, and as anybody in colonial Caribbean at the time does, there are no universities, so you have to either go get a scholarship to go to Oxford, as Eric Williams did, or you have to go to a historically black college in the United States, which is what Padmore did. He was at Fisk and at Howard, never graduated, became politically active, became a communist, was quickly taken up as a very eloquent leader and sent to the Soviet Union. He lived in Moscow from late 1929 to late 1931. Was elected to the Moscow Soviet with Stalin at various points, and then was based in Hamburg in Germany, working for the Communist International, editing The Negro Worker, which was circulating around the world. And that's how he became famous. His name was not originally George Padmore. That was his nom de guerre, which he kept for the rest of his life because he became so well known. He was working in Hamburg when Hitler came to power. Within 2 weeks of Hitler coming to power, he was arrested. And he spent, according to French Secret Service reports, he spent about 2 weeks in a Nazi prison and then was deported to Britain as a British subject. And then lived most of the rest of his life in Britain, became lifelong partners of an East End Jewish woman named Beatrice Pizer, who was born and raised just around the corner from where I am now, and remained a Marxist for the rest of his life, although he has the trajectory that you spoke earlier of as someone who realized that Stalin was not very committed to African independence and to Black life and rights, and so left the Soviet Union, but remained a Marxist, and always, unlike James, he and James disagreed quite a lot about this, about how much you criticize the Soviet Union. Padmore felt that he didn't want to give the enemy any fodder, and so he rarely criticized the Soviet Union. Even if he was critical of it in public, he rarely criticized it. And then he was the hub. So in that book, I argue that he's kind of the node that when anybody came to the London from a colony, it was, where is George Padmore? I need to meet George Padmore because he's going to put me in touch with everybody else. And I published that book in 2015, but I continue to find stuff that I didn't know about before. Stuff, he's publishing in South Africa, he has friends in Sri Lanka and South Asia and in Malaysia and all over the place. And he was just a hub that was both a place where people came to get information, but he also, from his flat, just was sending stuff out everywhere. And that's how I came to the newspaper stuff, because I realized how much he was not just publishing books, which he was, but also publishing extensively in newspapers and also being a circuit. So he would kind of clip and send stuff between various places. So a lot of the time it's hard to track, for example, how stuff might end up from a Barbados newspaper in a Nigerian newspaper, some of which was coming through him. Not all, but he was one of those nodes that led me into a deeper engagement with the newspapers.
Now, Prof, that inevitably leads me to another co-edited book. You're amazingly prolific. Decolonization and the Cold War
Yeah.
as a general topic, I guess. And I wonder if there are things you'd like to say about that book.
I think so that was the start of that was co-edited with Elizabeth Leake. And that was coming out of I think scholarship has really moved on from there. Um, it's been a long time since I thought about that book, to be perfectly honest.
This is a problem I sometimes have, Prof, where, for example, I interrogate somebody about something they wrote, and I've read it, 10 years or 20 years since they wrote it and since they last read it. In this case, we're really in trouble because I haven't read the book. I can't give a prompt.
Yeah, it's sitting here. It's right beside me. And I'm about to meet my co-editor next week.
Well, maybe you and she
It's
should come
hard for
into
me
the
to
pod
say.
one. Why? Maybe you and she should come into the pod one day, talk about the book once you've remembered what the heck it's about. Because obviously the clue is in what's on the tin, but there are no
Mhm.
doubt subtleties in particular studies. We can talk about that another time. Can I throw you back to somebody who was a boyhood hero of mine, but whom I was dissuaded by liberals surrounding me to stop loving? And that's Nkrumah,
Yeah.
because obviously he's a key figure in the James book, and you've
Yeah.
mentioned in the context of Ghana being the center of, in a sense, the winds of change, as Macmillan called them, for decolonization. Give us the scoop on Nkrumah, who I think is slowly being rediscovered somewhat as a writer. I mean, he wrote
Mm.
27,000 memoirs and whatnot, right? Theories
Yeah.
about life and so on.
Yeah. And so I teach a course on anti-colonial political thought in undergrad, and we read neocolonialism. So those works are coming back. I think, I mean, personally, I think the problem with Nkrumah is the problem of anyone who is adored, is that we get them on a pedestal and then somehow and then they get knocked down because they're human. And Nkrumah was facing incredible constraints. And Padmore worked in Ghana for Nkrumah. He was his advisor on African affairs until Padmore died in 1959. And he was already worried and about a kind of count. So all of these people are thinking in terms of a counter revolution. They are ready for the backlash. And so one analysis might be that Nkrumah um, was also thinking in that way, was ready for the backlash, and took a heavy hand, took an authoritarian turn, which CLR James then criticized. So that's in Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, is that he writes to Nkrumah by the early 1960s and says, "What are you doing? You're imprisoning your political opponents, and this isn't right. This isn't the way forward." Um, and so this is I'm guessing this is why people were persuaded against. It's very hard to um, both appreciate what someone did and was trying to do and the constraints that they face while also recognizing those bad decisions to quash political opposition, in particular with the case of Nkrumah. But there's a lot of really good. I would recommend another book that has just come out by Nana Osei on Nkrumah's. There's another book by Jeff Allman on Nkrumahism. And these really kind of get into the detail of life under Nkrumahism and what it was trying to do in terms of, for example, shaping modern development projects that were, and I think like many people of the time, there was a kind of less than critical approach to modernization and development that wanted to move the country forward and engaged in the big development projects. And Ghana is doing this. They're engaging in big development projects of various industries that are not, for example, listening to local fishermen, local industries, like creating big dams and projects that are not that have a kind of vision for the country and are pushing it through in ways that then aren't listening to local populations. And so those are what's coming out now in trying to better understand what Nkrumah was trying to do and where it might have taken turns that were not as attentive to the kind of idea of freedom that they also espoused.
Can I jump in with my East African Nyerere story at this point? So I went to a lecture that he gave, maybe 1994, Nyerere,
Yeah.
in which a young white student got up and described himself as African and said, this is obviously right after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the USSR and so on, Mr. Nyerere, it's quite obvious that everything you stood for is completely discredited. And no one believes in socialism anymore. Discuss. And I remember thinking, my God, what would I do if I were the old boy and were confronted with this? But of course, he was a bit subtler. And he said, that's a very good question, sir. Thank you so much for posing it. When I left as president of Tanzania, we had a full cohort of doctors and school teachers coming through within the country or returning to the country. After 20 years of deregulation and capitalist freedom, we have one surgeon in Tanzania. So that's an example of what socialism is. And of course, the room erupted. Everybody stood and applauded, except for the African, in inverted commas, who was duly chastened.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting when you get insider stories like that one, answers to these accusations of authoritarianism or of backsliding from socialism, whatever they might be. Really interesting. Did you like my little anecdote? Was that okay?
Yeah. No.
From a different trajectory, but
It's appreciating the value of hindsight with some generosity, I think, that is called for, that person did not have.
I hope so. And Prof, I had one last question for you, if I may. And after you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you may wish. That could take the form of something entirely new that we haven't discussed, or it might be something where you want to go back over terrain we've touched on, but where you want to remark on something else. Does that make sense as a means of bringing things to a conclusion?
Yep.
So my last question comes from a wonderful article that you co-wrote in Callaloo. And it's one of these articles I like because instead of being dutifully academic and saying what we're going to do at the beginning, you say that almost halfway through. And I really like it because it makes the reader keep going, or at least makes me keep going. And it's where you say that what you guys are doing is, and I'm going to quote, examine how the politics of empire shaped the experience of diaspora and of race in Britain. I wonder if you could elaborate, because it makes me think of that great slogan that comes from Sri Lankan Marxism, I think, we are here because you were there.
Mhm.
Uh, one of those great expressions that I hope keeps getting invoked. The other one I've always loved is visit America before it visits you, which I don't see so often.
So that that article again, and I'm trying to remember what we were trying to do was to think about processes of racialization in Britain and in the Caribbean as connected, as interlinked through something that I observed, which was the propensity for British colonial administration to deal with problems like the racial problem, the color problem, as it was called back then, or any problem in the empire with a commission of inquiry. So the article as a whole sort of takes commissions of inquiry as a main site where racialization is happening. And the point about the politics of empire being shaping the diaspora in Britain and in the colonies is that commissions of inquiry are being deployed as a way of as a bureaucratic way of deflecting the problem, as naming it as a problem, but then deflecting it to being solved. And I might digress slightly here, but for anybody who's watched The Thick of It, have you watched The Thick of It?
I couldn't
It's
possibly
Armando Iannucci,
I
or
couldn't
this
possibly comment.
brilliant Armando Iannucci um, television. And there's an episode of The Thick of It where this British politician gets in trouble. He does something he shouldn't. And they think that he's going to be sacked. He's going to be removed. And the whole episode is what's going to happen. He's going to be asked to step down as a minister in the government. And then at the very end, he gets a call where they say there's going to be a commission of inquiry. And he and everyone in the room erupt like, yes, because they know that a commission of inquiry means there's going to be no consequence.
Nothing will happen. For US
Nothing will
listeners, this is a Scottish writer, very brilliant, who wrote Veep, created Veep,
Yes.
which was on Showtime, maybe, I think.
Yes.
Very, very funny show. And wrote the original House of Cards, which was a British show from the early 90s. Whence comes the expression I just used, which is I couldn't possibly comment.
Yes, exactly.
Couldn't
So The
possibly
Thick of
comment
It
inside
is
the
the
commission.
earlier version of both of those shows, and it's a
Yeah.
much more British version of it. And it's the perfect epitome of what a commission of inquiry means and does. And I always think about that. But in this, it's thinking about how racialization is deflected and there's attempts to solve it, both in as an imperial tool and as a tool for solving the color problem, the racial problem in Britain. And by looking at that, we then try to say that this is one of the ways the politics of empire and the politics of race in Britain are are happening through the same set of processes as things that go through these bureaucratic structures that actually shape how people understand race in the first place. Yeah, that's my answer to that one.
A wonderful answer, and thank you very much. It's a great article. And one of the wonderful things about your articles, and I imagine the books too, is they have great stories,
Mm-hmm.
often quotations from things people have written that get the reader going. A bit like the way anthropologists like to begin things with a story of meeting someone, so historians like to begin things with a document. But there's also theory and commitment and good writing. So thank you for all of that. Can I now offer you the opportunity to add anything you wish?
That actually, your last point might be where I want to add. So because the book And one of the things that I tried to do in the book is show how, on the one hand, I mean, so the subtitle is How the West African and Caribbean Press Shaped Black Political Thought. And one of the things, and this is partly I've learned a lot from, I had the brilliant Karen Barber as a mentor in parts of this project, and I've learned a lot from her. But what I try to show is that these spaces are simultaneously playful and serious. They have kind of very serious political debate, but they also have poetry and prose, and they have writers who adopt kind of West African trickster modes and characteristics, and early kind of Afrofuturist shape-shifting characters. So there's a lot of experimental writing. So this is the link, kind of the good writing. These are places where the people are experimenting with political ideas and experimenting with writing. They're creating literally new genres and new forms of writing and speaking, and bringing in local ways of speaking into the papers as well. And so that's another aspect that I wanted people to appreciate, is the way that these political debates and ideas are happening through all these different genres that are really very both intellectually creative. They're creating new analysis and creations of artistically creative.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Prof. It's been lovely getting a chance to chat to you, to meet you,
Yeah.
albeit long distance, and really appreciate the work you do and also the time you've so generously given to us today.
Thank you for having me.